So absolutely massive news for Japanese boxing and for the whole Zuffa boxing stable because we know, you guys know that we're in this new era of boxing, a whole new climate where Zuffa boxing's in the fold and they're making their presence very, very known very, very quickly. We've seen them do a lot of cross promoting. Ryan Garcia was just on WWE. He hit a guy with a chair. We've seen Zuffa boxing do a show in England with Ryan Ruzicki versus Chris Smith. So they've already shown that they can cross promote. They've already shown that they're willing to take their business international. And they're going to continue taking the business international because it was reported that Zuffa Boxing has partnered with the fine folks at Next in Japan to provide coverage and access and broadcast to their events for the Japanese audience. And they're not charging extra. It's not going to be like here in the States where if you have DAZN, but they do a fight like Earl Spence, Tim Tszyu, they charge you an additional pay-per-view on top of your subscription. No, 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 no. Zuffa Boxing is going to include that as part of the Japanese viewers' regular subscription, with no additional pay-per-view cost. So, a lot of ways to interpret this. Lot of ways to interpret this. I'm gonna try to attack it from all angles, right? So first and foremost, for the American viewers that don't know about Next, Next will be the equivalent to, like, I don't know. You could say maybe Amazon Prime. They're pretty big. Like, they got a lot of viewers. They're one of the biggest streaming platforms in Japan, alongside Lamino and Abima TV. And they do a lot of boxing shows. They just broadcasted the recent world title triple header that featured Kenshiro Teraji, Shokichi Iwata, and Riku Masuda. So they're not strangers to the sport of boxing. So it allows Zuffa Boxing to get their shows in front of more eyeballs in one of the biggest and most strongest boxing markets in the world, and that is Japan. That's number one. Number two, now, we all know as of right now that the only Japanese fighter that's an outright, you could say, Zuffa fighter. Well, I don't want to say a Zuffa fighter, but a Turkey Outlaw Sheik fighter, if you will. We know Reito Tsutsumi has taken a much different approach than a lot of fighters from the land of the rising sun to progress his boxing career because, Turkey got a hold of him early. Turkey has had him boxing on big shows in America, like he fought on the Crawford Canelo undercard. He fought on the Berlanga Shiraz undercard. He's had about roughly 5 or 6 fights, and they've all been in either America or Saudi Arabia, right? So at some point in time, Reito Tsutsumi is going to have to headline a show in Japan, and I believe when that time comes, they put this kind of a deal in place for a guy like Reito Tsutsumi to headline when they do inevitably go back to Japan. It's been a bit disappointing as somebody who's followed Reito Tsutsumi before he even turned pro because he was one of the most hyped up Japanese prospects in recent memory, and he still has some hype around him, but I do feel like the hype has kind of died down just for the simple fact that Reito is getting buried deep on these big undercards, and a lot of people aren't seeing his talent, and he hasn't boxed in his home base, in his home market of Japan. So, I have been a bit frustrated about that because I thought before he turned pro that Reito Tsutsumi was going to be the kind of fighter that would be fast-tracked into world title contention within 5 or 6 fights. Like, I already thought he'd be fighting in, like, eliminator fights, and we'd already be talking about him fighting for a world title by his, by this time. I thought he was that kind of fighter. And I still do think he is that kind of fighter, but they're not moving him like that. So I hope they don't have him fighting a bunch of cans and overmatched opposition, because that's going to dull the blade and take away from him as a fighter. But nonetheless, I think this deal with Next is good for fighters like him. And also, if Zuffa Boxing is going to have any success, I do think, if they could find a place in the Japanese boxing market, it's going to help them because we've seen it over the last 10 to 15 years with fighters like Inoue, Juzen Nakatani, Kenshiro Teraji. There's a lot of talent in Japan, particularly in the lighter weight categories. And by them having this presence in Japan, it'll allow them to be more of an attractive option to the younger Japanese fighters, and conversely for the Japanese fighters that are looking to get more exposure and get their fights in front of some different types of eyeballs, this is also an option for them. And what I'm really hoping for, speaking from a unbiased standpoint, from the standpoint of, just not being biased one way or the other for or towards Zuffa boxing, and also as someone who knows, the Japanese fight scene relatively well. There's a lot of really good action fighters that, don't have big time promotion from the Mr. Honda or Ohashis of the world. And I feel like Zuffa boxing has to target those guys. So, like, for example, a guy that I can think of that I think is really exciting but isn't really backed, like a guy like Masahiro Suzuki, big, strong punching lightweight, who I think would be a great TV fighter. I feel like he would fit in perfectly to you next and fighting on Zuffa boxing in Japan and things like that. So, yeah, I think overall it's going to create more opportunities for Japanese fighters in the market. And I'm not necessarily against that because, what did Kanye West say? Like, no man should have all that power. Honda and Ohashi, they rule with an iron fist, which is good for some fighters and not so good for others. And yes, you got Kameda Promotions with Koki Kameda. You got Treasure Boxing Promotions with Masayuki Ito. That's more of a startup now. So I actually think in my whole time of covering boxing in Japan or covering Japanese boxing here on YouTube, I don't think there's ever been a time where Japanese fighters have had more opportunities, and I think this is going to add to the opportunity with them partnering with a big platform like UNEXT. And God, my fingers are crossed to kind of pin it back into Reito Tsutsumi. Let this be a signifier, please, that Reito Tsutsumi is going to be able to start headlining his own shows, because I feel like that young man, he's way too talented to not be the headliner fight, to not be the guy that people are talking about, and not be the guy that, cards are built around. I feel like you should be building cards around Reito Tsutsumi. He's one of the most talented fighters in Japan, point blank period. AIBA world champion, skillful southpaw, can punch with both hands, slick, can counter punch, can do a lot in that boxing ring. And I want people to know that he can do a lot in that boxing ring, but they're not going to know if you keep burying him on these prelims. So my fingers crossed that that's in the cards with UNEXT boxing in Japan. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Zuffa Boxing's entry into the Japanese boxing market. It is also worth noting that Terrence Crawford recently announced the start of Terrence Crawford Productions, a startup promotional company in Japan. So maybe he's going to have a part to play in this as well, as he's a guy that's been going to Japan a lot recently. And, maybe he's going to be, as a guy who fought on the first ever Zuffa card with Canelo, maybe he winds up having a part to play in this. Just some food for thought, guys. Trying to give you guys the overall scope of what this could all mean in the grand scheme of things. But those are my thoughts. I would like to hear what your guys' thoughts are in the comments down below. What do you think about Zuffa Boxing partnering up with UNEXT to enter the Japanese boxing market? And for the Japanese fans out there that understand the words that are coming out of my mouth, if you have any thoughts to give and any insights that could even inform me better, please feel free to do that in the comments down below, and I will greatly appreciate that. So yeah, leave your comments down below. Make sure you guys take the time to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.